keep the focus on this headline story now. The African Development Bank has approved the first ever emergency recovery loan of 5 billion rand to South Africa. That's in an effort to mitigate the socio-economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. There are, of course, now questions around where this puts the COVID-19 relief package that was announced by the finance minister, with government also approaching multilateral financial institutions for help. Let's get some analysis on this now. We're joined by economist at Econometrix, Dr. Azar Jammine. Dr. Jammine, thanks very much for your time this morning on the AM report. So this is an interesting story. How do we read this as South Africans? We know that we've had years of low growth long before the COVID-19 pandemic. We've always focused on the issue around the ballooning wage bill. We've pushed billions of rand into the black hole that has become our SOEs. How do we read this 5 billion rand loan in light of the 500 billion rand package that was announced by the president some months ago?
Well, you're quite right. You put it into the correct perspective. It's a helpful little loan in relation to the whole 500 billion rand package. The bigger picture is that in light of the very low growth rate in the economy, government tax revenues for personal tax, company tax, VAT, fuel levies, excise duties have plummeted. And so the government will now need to borrow at least 300 billion rand more than it had planned to do as recently as February. That 5 billion rand obviously plugs a tiny little hole in trying to make up that shortfall. A further $4.2 billion, or about 70 billion rand, due to be received from the IMF later this month, is also likely to help plug that hole. The attraction of these multilateral institutional loans is that they come at a very low interest rate. They come at dollar interest rates which are below 1%, whereas if the government had to go and borrow the money from the local market institutions, it would have to pay somewhere between 8 and 10% for that money. So the usefulness of these loans is that it avoids us having to spend as much on the debt servicing costs of that huge debt that would otherwise have had to be spent.
So what is the interest rate that we are borrowing this 5 billion rand at?
I'm not sure what the interest rate is, but I would imagine it's at a level below 1% or so. Okay. And even if it were a little higher than that, it would still be far less than the 8 to 10% interest rate that the government has to pay to financial institutions to attract them to buying its debt, which is one of the highest rates of interest paid by any government in the world, by the way.
Yeah, I'm just taking a look at, our rescue package compared to rescue packages around the world. I mean, the United States, around 10% of GDP. The UK, it's even bigger than that. In Japan, it's more than 20% of GDP. In South Africa, it's far less, isn't it, Dr. Jammine? I've got the number around 0.7% of GDP.
No, well, that's not exactly correct. Mm-hmm. If you take 500 billion rand, then that is nearly 9.5% of our GDP. But we know that that isn't all new money by any means. That 200 billion rand is coming from a loan guarantee scheme, and a further 130 billion is coming from the reprioritization of existing expenditure. Excuse me. So the net borrowing is in the region of about 140 billion.
Yeah. We're reading all of this and we're trying to make sense of the bigger picture of our economy and how much we're able to do to survive this COVID-19 period in our history. And if we look at the programs, some of the programs that we have in place as a country, the programs are there, aren't they, Dr. Jammine? It's the execution of those programs and our inability as a country in many ways to execute the programs that are in existence in South Africa.
You're absolutely correct. The programs are there and we just can't execute them because of a combination of two factors. Firstly, in many instances, the people who are supposed to manage the implementation do not have the requisite skills. And secondly, many who are also in charge of implementing try to siphon off some of those funds through procurement processes that benefit themselves and their pockets rather than the majority of people in the country.
Dr. Jammine, before we let you go, talk to us about the option of borrowing money from the IMF. I'm just looking at the latest news stories on that now. The IMF is now considering South Africa's loan request, and this was something when we were talking about the possibility of borrowing from the IMF. This was something that many of us are averse to. What's your take on that situation?
You've got to distinguish between loans and loans. The loan currently being offered by the IMF of $4.2 billion is specifically directed at trying to assist the South African government to pay for the ravages of the COVID virus, either in terms of financing help for needy children through food parcels, or helping, more importantly, the healthcare situation, providing sanitizers, providing ventilators, the cost of that, providing other PPE equipment. It's aimed at that. And it comes with very few, very strict conditions. Yes, the government has had to prove that it has a budget in place to try and curtail wasteful expenditure, but it doesn't go beyond that. If in different circumstances, and this is the real fear that we have in a few years' time, if we don't curtail our excesses, we are going to be forced to go to the IMF with cap in hand and say, please bail us out from, we just can't meet our expenditure targets and the need to borrow. We are not raising enough revenue. Now we need we go to the IMF and say, please assist us. And then they impose very harsh restrictions, forcing public servants, for example, to take huge pay cuts or be retrenched. And the economic policy making is then out of our hands. Yeah. But on this particular occasion, it's a deliberately COVID-directed assistance package that doesn't come with particularly stringent conditions, and therefore, we'd be foolish not to take it up.
One just wonders, you talk about us not being able to curtail our excesses in the years, the months or the years to come. One just wonders if we were to recoup the money that's been lost over the years, over more than a decade, through corruption, what position we would be in at the moment.
The estimates are anywhere between $500 billion and even over 1 trillion rand we would get back. We would not be in the mess that we're in at all. Simply by halting corruption right now, we might find ourselves amazed at how many resources we can actually harness to actually help fight poverty and inequality in the country. But it's become a sickness. Your former Minister Derek Hanekom was on your show just now saying it's a matter of greed. The politicians who already have a lot of money want still more, and so they redirect many of the funds that should be going towards helping their own people. Ubuntu is just not reaching those people.
Yeah, absolutely. What a bitter pill to swallow, particularly for the people who are hardest hit by lack of service delivery, especially during this time of COVID-19. Dr. Azar Jammine, thanks very much for your time this morning on the AM report. That's a developing story we're tracking for you there. The African Development Bank approving the first ever emergency recovery loan of around 5 billion rand to South Africa. Dr. Jammine telling us it will plug a tiny little hole in the situation that our economy is in at the moment.